Hello, I'm Richard Topolsky, Professor of Psychology at Augusta University. I'm an experimental psychologist, which means I study various things in psychology using the scientific method. I do not do therapies. I generally don't help people with their problems. I really try and study the human mind. My areas of interest are generally cognitive psychology and sensation perception. Got my attention growing up was the painting Orange Crush. It's about 8 feet high and 8 feet wide, and when you first look at it, it really isn't all that spectacular. While it may not look interesting when you first look at it, what happens if you stare into the painting for a while, the orange background crushes the little blue dots in that they all tend to disappear, fade in and out of vision. As well as if you then look at a blank wall afterwards, you'll see orange dots with blue background. And I kind of wondered how such a thing would happen. So not only does it have that painting, but it was really known for op art. And here's another fine example of that. Op art gets its name because the art creates optical illusions. And it made me wonder, how does your brain go and see a three-dimensional object out of some level of curvature in a painting? And of course there's other famous and noteworthy paintings throughout the gallery. So I highly recommend going if you ever have a chance to visit. Well, after entering college at the University of Buffalo, I was extremely fortunate to work in the lab of Irv Biederman. Irv Biederman is a cognitive psychologist, and at the time he had a Air Force grant to examine object recognition. This was in mid-1980s, and the goal of the research was just very basic, try and understand how people see objects. And it sounds like a very simple process, but it's really a complex endeavor. And to this day, we still have a lot more to learn about that. In the lab, Dr. Biederman developed recognition by component theory. And part of his theory is that to recognize an object, you must first recognize the parts of an object. That is, and to recognize the parts of an object, you first have to identify what parts may belong to an object. And some of that is through what we call non-accidental properties. So for example, in the square we have what can be considered an L junction and an L junction, as well as parallel lines. In this coffee cup, curvilinear lines, lines that are parallel but curve at the same rate, as well as a Y junction, which is very similar to a T junction. And the notion is, it is very unlikely in nature to find lines that curve together that don't belong to the same object, or are parallel together that do not belong to the same object. And from these non-accidental properties, we can create geons. And geons are three-dimensional volumetric shapes. So we can think of a coffee cup as being a cylinder with a C shape attached to it. So this is an object that is comprised of two different geometric shapes. When he developed his theory, he argued that we could have about 36 different basic geons. From mixing together these geons in different shapes, different orientations, you can create all the objects in the world. So for example, the difference between a coffee cup and a pail is simply the location in which you put the C shape. Now this is very similar, if you think about it, to language. Through 26 letters, we can create every word in the English language. As part of this, you have to first identify where a part begins and where it ends. And this leads to a very interesting idea put together by Hoffman and Richards. It's the idea of transversality. Man-made objects often have very distinct parts and straight lines and corners, where most of the time in nature you do not find that. Usually there's some level of curvature. According to Hoffman and Richards, the idea is that every object has a point of maximum and minimum curvature. And thus we can identify a part of an object simply by looking at two minimums that surround a maximum. And here's a couple illusions that I'll use to illustrate this. The one up here is called Sarah Nader, kind of cute little name. This other one here is the famous face vase illusion. So a lot of the reversible objects and illusions you see illustrate this property. You will either see a vase here where you can drink from the top and you have a handle and there's a base, or you see two faces with the noses pointing at each other, a set of lips and a chin. Well, how do we define parts? According to transversality, if I take a minimum point of curvature, basically an innie belly button, and then take a maximum point of curvature outward, and then back to a minimum point of curvature inward, I have a nose. If I go another part, I go in, out, in, and I have an upper lip, in, out, in, and then I have the bottom lip, and so on. Well, notice what happens when we reverse the image and start looking at it as a goblet or a vase. So now what we do is we take what used to be a maximum and say it's an in minimum instead of a maximum. What used to be an innie is now an outie, and then we go back to an innie and we see that's the bottom of the top of the vase, or a part where you can imagine it's holding water. And each one of these ridges, what used to be an innie to form the base of the nose, is now an outer lip or edge. Here's a famous example of that face-vase illusion. It was constructed to commemorate the Queen of England and her anniversary to her husband. Next to it is one of my favorite illusions, and when you look here, you would swear it's a triangle on top of another triangle. But quite honestly, there are no triangles here. This is a simple illusion that you see a line here, and it's called subjective contours, because subjectively you see a line here when there isn't one. Why does that happen? Well, we usually are used to seeing objects that are shaped nicely. We're used to seeing full circles instead of Pac-Man shaped objects. We're used to seeing full triangles as opposed to ones that are partially blocked or nothing there. So your brain wants to say something must be blocking it, and it creates lines that aren't there. I want to use this segue to a notion that much of what you see in the world is really a process of really mental illusions that have come about because they're evolutionarily adaptive. This is mental software you're born with that helps you navigate the world. Other times, illusions may occur on a retinal level. So relative to the software of the mind, what we can do is see how the neurons themselves act in the visual system, and in this case you will see some illusions of motion simply because motion detectors will want to see motion occurring in these objects. A tremendous example of this is the Hermann grid illusion. I'll try not to leave this up too long because I'm sure it's probably affecting your eyesight a little bit, hopefully not making people too dizzy. But what happens is wherever you're looking, you'll see a perfectly good white circle, and out there in the periphery, in the rest of your vision, you will see black dots popping up and disappearing. The reason for this, as I said, it all has to do with information being processed on your retina. That basically, where you tend to have high detailed visual information is the fovea. You have a lot of cones there which are very good at detailed processing, and part of the reason they're good at detailed processing, the ratio of cones to bipolar cells is much less, so there's no information lost. They're not sharing what they see. So the cones are all saying, I see a distinct white circle, and the ones a little further away from it saying, I see black edges. Comparatively, rods have more convergence. The reason this occurs is the information they provide is average across all the cells. So they have a bigger area that is being processed, and if half of the cells are saying I see black, half of the cells are saying I see white, that becomes averaged out to gray, so there's less detail and thus the illusion that the circles are changing color, when in fact it's a limitation in the visual system. Now, mind you, it's good that we have that limitation, because too much information would be overwhelming to our system. So I want to get back to the notion that you are born with some pre-existing knowledge that helps you navigate the world. These are generally heuristics and just general beliefs of the mind that you're really born with and you don't have to learn. As someone who takes an evolutionary approach towards psychology, that your mind becomes equipped with things that best benefit you to survive the world, I've never been a big fan of the notion of a blank slate. A blank slate was the idea that you're not born with any pre-existing knowledge. Everything you learn is a byproduct of your environment, society, whatever happens to you after birth, or in the womb potentially. Well, the problem is that you need learning mechanisms. You need pre-existing knowledge to functionally navigate the world. And I think this was shown in no better case than a study done in the 1950s. What the researcher did is he took a brand new chick that was freshly hatched out of an egg. Being a freshly hatched chicken, it never saw a shadow before. So the experimenter, what they did is they took a silhouette and they had the silhouette move in a direction that cast the shadow. And the chicken didn't move. However, when they moved the exact same silhouette in the opposite direction, the chicken ran and hid. Why? Because in the first direction, the shadow that is cast is of a non-predatory bird. That is, things like geese have long necks and short bodies, and they're not a threat to chickens. However, the shadow going in the opposite direction is a predatory bird, something like a hawk. Well, if you wait to learn that a shadow that looks like that is a predator, you'll be lunch and therefore you won't survive. So if a chicken can come into the world with a pre-existing knowledge that not all shadows are bad, but certain types of shadows are bad, then I hope we can make the leap of faith that humans come in with some pre-existing knowledge. So I'll show you some examples of how the pre-existing knowledge works and affects our perceptions. So wonderful little example here, looking at a human face, and you can see when it rotates through space, we're looking at the back of a mask, and all of a sudden it pops out face forward. Why? Because through years of evolution in your life, you've never seen the inside of faces. Here you get as an example of shadow information. You don't have to learn anything about shadows. The box is not moving at all, the green square. What is moving is we put a shadow there. So what do you know? That, well, if a shadow is still, the object is still. If a shadow moves, the object must be moving. Thus, we attribute the moving shadow to the object. This is a very difficult thing for us to try and study in artificial intelligence. Using this video, I will show you the ball actually moving, changing each time just based on the shadow. So it's moving along that exact same line. I think we'd all agree, since the shadow is touching the ball, it's moving along the ground. Now I simply change the shadow, not the ball at all, and then I can even make the shadow sometimes touch the ball, sometimes not, and the exact same movement of the ball is perceived completely differently. Now, keep in mind, you never probably thought about shadows before and thought what they mean, or you had to learn information about shadows. This follows some general heuristics that we have, that light comes from above, that lighting sources are usually stationary, and finally, the manner in which a shadow interacts with an object tells us a lot about the object itself. Coming full circle, I mentioned that the first study I was involved in was in Dr. Biederman's lab, and that was funded by the Air Force. Part of the goal of that research was to eventually get unmanned aircraft. Well, I'm happy to say, in part, my career has come full circle. That was basic research, and in basic research you conduct studies for knowledge's sake. You simply want to understand the world or how people work. But out of basic research comes some applied applications. And applied research means you conduct research to solve a problem. Well, for the last few years I've been fortunate enough to help the U.S. Army to help train soldiers to optimize their effectiveness. It was a real thrill for me because I was able to do this using unmanned aircraft. So I went from in a laboratory just seeing how people recognize objects to actually standing out in the desert helping soldiers best utilize these devices. I want to conclude with what I would hope you can consider some very good career opportunities. Augusta University is in Augusta, Georgia. We are developing a cyber program in part because Fort Gordon, which is in Augusta, is going to be the home of the Cyber Command for the United States military. They're moving down from Fort Meade in the next few years, as well as the National Security Agency, NSA, will have operations here. And cybersecurity is what I believe is a wonderful opportunity for anyone entering college. It's important that we keep our world safe and free. More and more of our life is becoming computer-based, technology-based. Every day you hear about hacks occurring. There's a map of current cyber threats that are actually going on in this minute. And you can see, yes, the U.S. engages in some as well as receives some. And as people are attacked, you need to defend. And this has to deal with our infrastructure, the things that keep the lights on, as well as roads and bridges. There's more technology in every little piece of the world these days. And as it stands now, there's a tremendous need for individuals to get into the world of cyber. So much so that the federal government is offering scholarships for students to become part of the cyber community. What does this have to do with psychology? A lot. Computer programmers and mathematicians think like computer programmers and mathematicians. You need psychologists to help train people not to click on phish emails, to change behaviors, to try and understand the psychology behind some of the attackers, to identify them. The federal government is offering, as you can see, up to $22,500 in tuition per year to help people go through college in cyber-related fields. And at the end, after you graduate, in return, there's an obligation to do an equal amount of service in the government in the cyber community. So if you get 3 years of tuition, you would spend 3 years in the government. Whether it's Augusta University or some other university, I think this is a tremendous area to go into, given that it's estimated that currently only 10,000 students graduate in this field per year. Supply and demand would dictate these are good paying jobs and interesting and fun paying jobs. You're going out, solving problems, helping the world become a better place. I'd like to leave you with 1 or 2 bits of advice. Overall, try and detach yourself from your cell phone and technology however best you can. The brain wants information. The problem is a lot of the things you think are information really aren't that informative. There's no pressing need to know what somebody else had for lunch or what they're doing every minute of the day. Go out and live life using your mind rather than trying to live it through an artificial little piece of technology. And more importantly, related to that, do not text and drive or talk and drive. As someone who studies attention and visual processing, you cannot drive and text at the same time. Study after study says that, and you should honestly put down the phone, because in the bottom line, what message is worth your life or somebody else's? Hope you enjoyed the presentation.